August 1887, Northern Arizona Territory. The mule train left at dawn, and nobody looked back. 15-year-old Emmett Calloway stood at the edge of the survey camp with a canvas sack over one shoulder and a cracked shovel in his hand, watching the line of men and animals shrink along the ridgeline until they dissolved into the haze of pine and dust. The foreman, a thick-set man named Harker, had told him the night before, not unkindly, but not gently either, that the mining survey was done and there was no room for a boy who couldn't swing a pick fast enough. "You'll find your way back to Prescott," Harker had said, rolling a cigarette between stained fingers. "It's only 40 miles. Follow the creek south." 40 miles of dry forest, box canyon, and rattlesnake country. Emmett had nodded. He had learned early that arguing with men like Harker only made things worse. Words were just sounds. They couldn't hurt him unless he let them. So he stood in the clearing where the tents had been, listening to the silence that filled the space the crew had left behind, and instead of walking south toward Prescott, he looked around. He had been looking around his whole life. It was the thing adults noticed least and valued last, a boy who watched instead of talked. His mother had died when he was 9, his father 2 years later in a shaft collapse near Globe. Since then, Emmett had been passed from uncle to boarding house to work crew, always the youngest, always the quietest, always the one sent to fetch water or hold the lamp while others did the real work. But holding the lamp meant seeing things, and fetching water meant walking the land. Now, standing alone in the abandoned camp at 6,000 feet elevation, surrounded by ponderosa pine that stretched to the horizon in every direction, Emmett saw what the survey crew had not bothered to notice. The soil was dry. Not August dry, which was expected, but cracked and powdery in a way that spoke of months without real rain. He knelt and pressed his thumb into the earth. It crumbled like ash. The creek Harker had mentioned was running thin, barely a trickle over pale stones. He stood and faced the wind. It came from the southwest, steady and warm, carrying a faint smell that was not quite smoke, but not quite clean either. A kind of electrical dryness, the way the air tasted before a storm that never delivered rain. He looked at the forest floor. Decades of pine needles lay in thick mats, brown and brittle, layered so deep that in places his boots sank 3 inches before finding solid ground. Dead branches crisscrossed the understory like kindling stacked by a careless hand. The trees themselves stood close together, their lower limbs dry and resinous, reaching toward each other like arms waiting to pass a flame. Emmett had seen a forest fire once, from a distance, when he was 12. It had moved faster than a horse could run. The sound had been like a freight train made of heat, and the sky had turned the color of a bruise. 3 homesteads and a sawmill had been erased in a single afternoon. He looked at the land around him now and understood, with the quiet certainty that came from watching rather than talking, that fire was not a question of if, it was a question of when. And so, while every instinct said to build upward, a lean-to, a cabin frame, some elevated platform the way the crew had done, Emmett Calloway made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He started digging. The limestone outcrop sat 200 yards east of the abandoned camp, half hidden by scrub oak and a tumble of fallen rock. Most people would have walked past it. Emmett had noticed it weeks ago while hauling water, the way the stone jutted from the hillside at an angle that suggested something hollow behind it. He spent the first day clearing brush and loose stone from the base. By afternoon, using the cracked shovel and a flat piece of shale as a wedge, he had opened a gap wide enough to crawl through. Inside, The air was cooler by 15 degrees. He could feel it on his face like a damp cloth. The space was not large, perhaps 8 feet deep and 5 feet wide, with a ceiling that sloped downward toward the back. Part of it had collapsed at some point, leaving a mound of rubble and packed earth that narrowed the usable space. It was not a cave, exactly. It was a wound in the hillside, half healed by time and gravity. But the stone was solid where it had not crumbled, and the floor was dry limestone, not clay. Water would not pool here the way it would in softer ground. Living like a mole, he muttered to himself, and almost smiled. He could hear Harker's voice in his head, the easy contempt men reserved for ideas they hadn't thought of first. He began the work. The first task was structural. The collapsed section of ceiling needed reinforcement before anything else. Emmett felled 4 young ponderosa pines, each about 6 inches in diameter, which was all he could manage with the hand axe left behind in the camp's refuse pile, and stripped them of bark. He cut them to length, notching the ends so they would seat against the stone walls without sliding. Then he wedged them vertically beneath the weakest section of ceiling, packing the gaps with flat stones and a mixture of mud and pine pitch. It was slow work. His hands blistered, then bled, then calloused. The cracked shovel handle bit into his palm with every stroke. He learned to wrap it with strips torn from his spare shirt, which helped for a few hours before the cloth wore through. The second task was ventilation. An underground space without airflow was a tomb. Emmett had watched smoke in campfires his entire life, the way it curled toward any opening, the way a cross-draft could pull a lazy fire into a roaring one. He understood, in the practical way of someone who had never read a physics textbook but had spent years sitting beside fires. That air moved from cool to warm and from high pressure to low. He carved 2 ventilation shafts. The first angled upward from the back of the cave at roughly 45 degrees, emerging among rocks on the hillside above. The second opened near the entrance, lower and angled with the prevailing southwest wind. The idea was simple. Wind entering the lower shaft would push stale air out through the upper one, creating a current that refreshed the space without allowing direct flame or heavy smoke to penetrate. He tested it with a smudge of green pine needles, watching the smoke drift through the cave and exit through the upper shaft. It worked. Not perfectly, but well enough to keep the air breathable. He adjusted the angle of the lower shaft twice, widening the mouth and adding a short stone baffle that forced incoming air to turn a corner before entering the main chamber. Sparks, he reasoned, could not follow a sharp turn. Smoke could, but slowly, and by then it would have cooled. The third task was drainage. The first heavy rain answered a question he had not yet thought to ask. Where does the water go? It went everywhere. He woke one night to the sound of rushing water and found 2 inches of muddy runoff pouring through the entrance, pooling against the back wall and softening the earth beneath his timber braces. One support beam shifted with a groan that sounded almost human. For a terrible moment, he thought the whole ceiling would come down. It held. Barely. The next morning, working in a cold drizzle, Emmett dug a trench. It ran from the cave entrance downhill for 30 feet, angled to catch runoff before it could reach the opening. He lined it with flat stones set edge to edge, creating a channel that directed water away from the shelter. Inside, he carved a shallow gutter along the base of each wall, sloping toward the entrance, so that any moisture that did penetrate would drain outward rather than collect. Every improvement came from failure. The first set of timber braces had been too thin. He replaced them with thicker ones. The first ventilation shaft had been too straight. He rebuilt it with an offset. The drainage trench had been too shallow. He dug it deeper. The entrance, originally just a gap in the rock, he fitted with a door made from a frame of green pine planks, lashed together with braided bark cordage and sealed with a layer of packed clay that could be dampened in an emergency. By the end of the third week, the cave was habitable, not comfortable. The ceiling was too low to stand fully upright, and the floor was hard limestone that no amount of pine bough bedding could make soft. But habitable. A place where a person could sleep dry, breathe clean air, and survive what was coming. Food was the hardest problem. The creek yielded small trout if he was patient. He found stands of wild amaranth in a clearing half a mile south, and the scrub oaks produced acorns that could be leached of their bitterness in running water. But protein was scarce. He built snares from braided cordage, catching rabbits twice in the first week, and then nothing for 5 days. He learned to check the snares at dawn and dusk, to move them when the trails showed no fresh tracks, to set them where droppings and nibbled bark told him animals actually traveled rather than where he assumed they would. He kept no journal. He had no paper, but he kept count of days by scratching marks on the cave wall with a piece of quartz. 23 marks, 24, 25. On the 27th day, 2 men from a logging outfit passed within a quarter mile of his shelter. Emmett heard their voices and went to meet them, hoping to trade labor for salt and flour. They were rough men, bearded and sun-darkened, and when they saw the cave entrance and the ventilation shafts and the drainage trench, the older one laughed until he coughed. "Boy's living like a prairie dog," he said to his companion. "Dug himself a burrow." The younger one shook his head. "You could build a proper cabin in less time than it took to scratch that hole." "A cabin burns," Emmett said quietly. They looked at him. The older man shrugged. "Everything burns, son. That's what God made rivers for. You run." They gave him a small sack of cornmeal and a twist of salt pork, more out of pity than respect, and continued on their way. Emmett watched them go and said nothing more. He took the cornmeal back to his shelter and mixed it with water and cooked it on a flat stone outside the entrance. He ate slowly, thinking about the timber braces, the ventilation angles, the drainage trench, thinking about the dry wind that had not stopped blowing from the southwest in 4 weeks, thinking about the pine needle carpet that lay across the forest floor like a promise written in brown and amber. Running was what people did when they had not prepared. He had no intention of running. September came, and the forest grew quieter. Birds that had sung through August fell silent or departed south. The creek dropped to a thread of water barely wide enough to fill his canteen. The air itself seemed to tighten, as if the sky were holding its breath. Emmett reinforced the entrance door with a second layer of clay, this one mixed with fine gravel for strength. He gathered 4 buckets of wet earth from the creek bed and stored them inside the cave, covered with damp cloth. If fire came, he would pack the entrance with this mud, sealing it as tightly as he could manage. He widened the upper ventilation shaft by 2 inches and added a stone cap that could be partially closed, reducing the opening to a narrow slit. The idea was to allow just enough airflow to keep the cave breathable while blocking the worst of any smoke that might be driven down by wind. He did not know if it would work. He had never tested it against actual fire. Everything he had built was theory, observation translated into timber and stone and hope. On the afternoon of September 14th, the sky turned orange. Emmett saw it from the clearing where he had been gathering the last of the wild amaranth seed heads. The western horizon, which should have been blue fading to white above the distant San Francisco peaks, was instead a wall of amber haze that climbed from the tree line to the heavens. At first, he thought it was dust. Then the smell reached him, not the clean smell of a campfire, but the thick, acrid stench of a forest being consumed, resin and sap and living wood and dead needles and soil and everything that had grown and fallen and accumulated for decades, all of it burning at once. The wind shifted. It came harder now, gusting from the west instead of the southwest, carrying flakes of ash that drifted down like gray snow. The temperature climbed. Emmett could feel it on his skin, not the gradual warmth of afternoon sun, but a sudden radiating heat that pressed against his face and arms, as if he were standing too close to a stove. He did not panic. Panic was for people who had not planned. He moved quickly but methodically. First, the 4 buckets of wet earth. He carried them to the cave entrance and set them just inside. Then he soaked the entrance door with water from the creek. 3 trips, the last one at a run, because the heat was building faster than he had expected. He dampened the exterior clay, pressing it smooth, filling every crack. In the distance, he heard a sound like thunder, except it did not stop. It rolled and built and deepened into a continuous roar that vibrated in his chest. He looked west and saw, above the tree line, a column of smoke so vast it seemed to lean against the sky like a dark cathedral. Animals came first. A mule deer doe and her fawn crashed through the scrub oak 20 yards from his entrance, eyes white with terror, running east without looking. A pair of coyotes followed, loping with an urgency that stripped away their usual caution. Squirrels poured through the canopy above him, leaping from branch to branch in a rippling wave of fur and panic. Then the birds, jays and woodpeckers and a red-tailed hawk, all flying east, all silent. Emmett sealed the entrance. He pulled the pine plank door into place, braced it with a timber crossbar, and packed the wet earth around every edge. He worked the mud into the gaps with his fingers, smoothing it, pressing it, leaving no opening larger than a pencil. Then he retreated to the back of the cave, where the air was coolest, and sat with his back against the limestone wall. The sound grew. It was no longer thunder. It was something older and larger, the sound of a landscape being unmade. Trees did not simply burn, they exploded. Emmett could hear the sharp crack of trunks splitting as superheated sap expanded beyond what wood could hold. Each detonation was followed by a rush of air, as if the fire were breathing in before exhaling another wave of flame. The ground trembled. Small stones shifted on the cave floor. Dust sifted down from the ceiling between the timber braces. The temperature inside the cave rose, slowly at first, then faster. The stone walls, which had always been cool to the touch, grew warm, then hot. Emmett pressed his palm against the limestone and felt it throb like the skin of a living thing. Smoke found its way inside. Not through the sealed entrance, the wet clay held, but through the upper ventilation shaft. Despite the baffle, despite the offset angle, smoke curled down into the cave in thin, acrid tendrils that stung his eyes and caught in his throat. He pulled his shirt over his nose and breathed through the fabric, each breath shallow and deliberate. If he had miscalculated the airflow, if the lower ventilation shaft was drawing fire-heated air rather than filtering it, the cave would fill with smoke and carbon monoxide, and he would lose consciousness before he could unseal the door. He would die underground, in the shelter he had built with his own hands, and the logging men would have been right after all. He thought about that for a moment. Then he thought about the angles of the shafts, the stone baffles, the offset he had rebuilt twice. He thought about the smoke tests he had run with green pine needles, He thought about the physics of air. Cool air falling, hot air rising, cross-ventilation creating a current that favored the larger opening. He breathed. The smoke thinned. The lower shaft was pulling in air from the sheltered eastern face of the hillside, where the fire had not yet reached, and the upper shaft was venting the worst of the smoke upward. The system was working. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to keep him alive. Hours passed. The roar outside rose and fell in waves, each crescendo accompanied by a pulse of heat through the stone walls. At one point, the temperature inside the cave climbed so high that sweat ran freely down his face and pooled in the hollow of his throat. His lips cracked. His eyes burned. He did not move. He sat with his back against the warm stone and his shirt over his face and his hands flat on his knees, and he waited. He thought about his mother, who had taught him to watch before speaking. He thought about his father, who had taught him that rock had moods, that it could be read like a face if you looked carefully enough. He thought about the survey crew and Harker and the logging men and everyone who had ever looked at him and seen nothing worth keeping. He thought about the cave. His cave. The timber braces he had notched and fitted. The ventilation shafts he had carved and tested. The drainage trench he had dug and lined with stones. Every piece of it built from failure, from the beam that almost collapsed, from the shaft that was too straight, from the trench that was too shallow. Every improvement earned through error and corrected through patience. Surviving was building. He closed his eyes and listened to the fire pass overhead like a living thing, enormous, indifferent, and beautiful in its terrible way. And he breathed. He woke before dawn. He had not intended to sleep, but exhaustion had pulled him under at some point in the night, and now he lay curled on the limestone floor with his cheek pressed against warm stone. The sound was gone, not reduced or distant. Gone. The roar that had filled the world for hours had been replaced by a silence so complete that for a moment Emmett wondered if he had lost his hearing. Then he heard a small sound, the faint hiss of air moving through the lower ventilation shaft, carrying the smell of char and wet ash. He rose stiffly and approached the entrance. The clay seal was intact, but cracked in places, dried by the heat into a brittle shell. He pulled the crossbar free and pushed the door outward. The world had changed. Where there had been forest, there was nothing. The ponderosa pines that had stretched to the horizon in every direction were gone, not fallen, not damaged, but erased. In their place stood blackened pillars, some still glowing at the base with deep orange embers, others reduced to stumps no higher than his knee. The forest floor, which had been a thick carpet of brown needles, was now a plain of white and gray ash that shifted in the faint morning breeze, like the surface of a dead sea. The sky was the color of milk, heavy with suspended particles that caught the first light and turned it into something flat and directionless. There were no shadows. There was no color. The world had been reduced to black and white, and the faint, persistent smell of something that had finished burning. Emmett stepped out of the cave and stood in the clearing that was no longer a clearing, because there was nothing left for it to be cleared from, and looked at what remained. His drainage trench was intact, the stone lining blackened but unbroken. The scrub oak that had hidden the cave entrance was gone, leaving only a twisted black skeleton. The flat stone where he had cooked his cornmeal was still there, dusted with ash. His snare lines had burned away. He turned in a slow circle. In every direction, as far as he could see, the forest was destroyed. Miles of timber reduced to charcoal. The creek bed was dry, its water evaporated by heat. The logging road that the survey crew had used was a faint gray line in a landscape of devastation. Nothing else stood. No lean-to, no cabin, no structure of any kind. The wooden shelters that other men might have built, the kind the logging men had recommended, would have been consumed in the first minutes of the fire, along with anyone inside them. His cave was the only structure still standing. He went back inside and drank the last of his water, warm and tasting faintly of limestone, and sat on the floor and allowed himself, for the first time in 27 days, to feel something other than purpose. He felt proud, not the loud pride of men who wanted others to see their victories, but the quiet pride of someone who had looked carefully at the world, understood what it was telling him, and acted accordingly. They found him 3 days later. A cavalry patrol from Fort Whipple, riding east to assess the fire damage, spotted the cave entrance from the logging road. They had expected to find nothing alive. The fire had consumed nearly 18,000 acres of timber in 36 hours, driven by winds that had exceeded 40 miles per hour at their peak. 2 homesteads had been destroyed. A sawmill crew of 9 men had been forced to shelter in a creek bed, where 3 had died of burns and smoke inhalation. The patrol lieutenant, a lean man named Corwin, dismounted and walked to the cave entrance with his hand on his sidearm, expecting to find an animal den. Instead, he found a 15-year-old boy sitting cross-legged on a limestone floor, thin and ash-streaked, with a cave system behind him that featured timber braces, ventilation shafts, a drainage trench, and a sealed entrance door. "Who built this?" Corwin asked. "I did," Emmett said. Corwin looked at the ventilation shafts. He looked at the stone baffles. He looked at the timber braces notched and fitted against the ceiling. He was a military engineer by training, and he recognized the principles, not the polish of formal education, but the bones of real understanding. "How old are you?" 15, sir." Corwin said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned to his sergeant. "Get this boy water and food, and get me a pencil and paper. I want to document this." The Army report, filed in October 1887, described Emmett's shelter as a subterranean refuge of remarkable design for its simplicity and effectiveness, constructed by a miner without formal training. It recommended the principles of ventilated underground shelter construction be studied for potential application in military field fortification. Emmett did not read the report. He would not learn of its existence until years later. What mattered to him at the time was simpler. He was alive, and the land around him, though blackened and silent, was already beginning to change. Within a week of the fire, he saw the first green shoots pushing through the ash. Fireweed, with its slender stems and pink blossoms, rose from the charred earth as if it had been waiting underground for exactly this moment. The creek returned, slowly at first, then with growing confidence, as if the watershed above was releasing water it had held back during the fire. By the end of September, a thin green fuzz covered the burn scar like the first growth on a healing wound. Emmett watched it all. He sat at the entrance of his cave each morning and watched the land rebuild itself, and he understood something that the logging men and the survey crew and Harker and everyone who had ever dismissed him would never fully grasp, that the earth was patient, and that patience was not weakness. It was the deepest kind of strength. He stayed. Not because he had nowhere else to go. Prescott was still 40 miles south, and the cavalry patrol had offered to escort him, but because the land needed someone who understood it. The burn scar would regrow, but how it regrew depended on what came next. Whether the new growth was managed or neglected, whether the watershed was protected or exploited, whether the lessons of the fire were remembered or forgotten. Emmett expanded the cave system over the following year, adding a second chamber for food storage and a third, smaller alcove that he used as a workshop. He developed a water catchment system using stone channels that directed rainwater from the hillside into a clay-lined cistern. He experimented with char from the burned forest, mixing it into soil to create planting beds where he grew beans, squash, and a stubborn patch of corn that refused to thrive above 6,000 feet but produced enough ears to supplement his diet. People came. Not many at first. A trapper who had heard about the boy in the cave from the cavalry patrol, a family of homesteaders looking for safe ground after losing their cabin in the fire. Emmett showed them the principles. Dig into the hillside, not against it. Use the stone as your ceiling where you can. Angle your ventilation shafts with the wind, not against it. Build your drainage before your walls. He did not lecture. He showed. And because he was young and quiet and had no authority except competence, people listened differently than they would have to an older man. They listened the way you listen to someone who has survived something you fear. By 1890, 3 more underground shelters had been built along the ridge, each one adapted to its specific site, but all following the principles Emmett had discovered. A small community formed, not a town exactly, but a collection of people who understood that this particular landscape demanded a particular kind of humility. A girl named Clara Marsh arrived with her father in the spring of 1890. She was 16, the daughter of a surveyor who had been hired to map the fire's perimeter for a timber company. Clara was quiet in the way Emmett was quiet, not shy, but attentive. She carried a leather-bound notebook in which she sketched plants and rock formations with a precision that made Emmett's scratched tally marks on the cave wall seem crude by comparison. She was the first person who asked him not how he had survived the fire, but why he had known it was coming. The soil, he said, the wind, the needles on the ground. Everything was telling the same story. I just listened. Clara looked at him for a long moment, then opened her notebook to a page of careful sketches showing the cross-section of a ventilation shaft. "I'd like to document your designs," she said, "properly, with measurements." They spent the summer of 1890 measuring every angle, every dimension, every principle that Emmett had discovered through failure and rebuilt through patience. Clara drew cross-sections of the cave system, the ventilation shafts, the drainage trenches. She recorded the temperatures inside and outside, morning and evening, and calculated the cooling effect of the limestone and the airflow. She documented which timber species resisted rot and which did not, which clay mixtures held up to rain and which crumbled. Emmett had never seen his work written down before. Seeing it on paper, precise, measured, real, made something shift inside him. It was not pride, exactly. It was recognition. The knowledge had been in his hands and in his eyes for years. Now it existed outside of him, in a form that could be carried, shared, and built upon. Emmett Calloway lived on that ridge for 61 years. He married Clara Marsh in 1895, in a ceremony held at the entrance of the original cave, which by then had been expanded into a comfortable home with plastered walls, a stone hearth vented through the old upper shaft, and a wooden porch that looked out over a forest that had grown back taller and thicker than the one the fire had taken. They raised 4 children. The eldest, Thomas, became a civil engineer who designed fire-resistant structures for the Forest Service. The second, Mary, studied botany at the University of Arizona and published a paper on post-fire forest regeneration that cited her father's observations, recorded in her mother's careful hand, as primary source material. The third, Samuel, became a teacher. The youngest, Rose, stayed on the ridge and expanded the underground shelter network into a system that, during the Great Fire of 1924, sheltered 47 people and 12 horses while the surface burned. Clara's notebooks, 14 volumes in all, were donated to the Territorial Archives after her death in 1938. They remain there today, their pages yellowed but legible, their measurements precise, their drawings clear enough to build from. Emmett died on a cool morning in October 1948 at the age of 76. He was sitting on the porch of the home he had built into the hillside, watching the sun come up through the ponderosa pines, the children of the trees the fire had taken, and he was not afraid of anything. His granddaughter, who was 12 and had his same habit of watching instead of talking, sat beside him. "How did you know?" she asked. She had heard the story many times, but she always asked again, the way children do when they sense there is more beneath the surface. Emmett looked at the forest. He looked at the way the light fell through the canopy in columns of gold and green, the way the shadows pooled beneath the old trees like cool water. "I looked," he said. "That's all. I just looked at what was there." He closed his eyes. The breeze carried the scent of pine and limestone, and from somewhere, inside the hillside, came the faint, steady breath of the cave. Cool air moving through shafts he had carved 60 years ago with a cracked shovel and bleeding hands. The ridge still stands. The caves still breathe. And in the Territorial Archives, in Clara's careful handwriting, the measurements remain, waiting for anyone patient enough to read them and brave enough to dig.